have always been a man of meticulous tradition. To some, my habits might seem like a cage, but to me, they are the only thing keeping the chaos of the world at bay. Every Valentine's Day for the last 5 years, I have booked the corner booth at L'Amour. It is the kind of establishment where the floor is covered in carpet so thick it swallows the sound of footsteps, and the waiters move like ghosts in white silk gloves. The lighting is intentionally low, a warm, amber haze designed to hide the flaws in every face and the lies in every conversation. "Table for two, Mr. Vance?" the maitre d' asked. His name was Leonard, and his voice was a practiced, oily slide that grated on my nerves. "Actually, Leonard, it's a table for 3 this year," I replied, adjusting my silk tie in the gilded mirror by the entrance. I looked sharp, successful, composed, and entirely in control of the situation. Leonard paused, a brief flicker of professional confusion crossing his face before the mask snapped back into place. "Of course, sir. An unexpected guest? Right this way." I sat down and carefully placed a small, velvet-covered box on the empty chair to my left. To my right sat Elena. She looked breathtaking in her black lace dress, her dark hair pinned up with the silver comb that caught the candlelight. She hadn't said a word since we left the house, but then again, Elena had always been the quiet type, especially when she felt the weight of an argument. The waiter arrived, his movements silent and efficient. He poured the wine, a 2015 vintage that smelled of oak, leather, and old secrets. I ordered the Chateaubriand for 2, and for the third guest, I requested a side of bitter greens and a glass of cold water, which I placed directly in front of the velvet box. "Is the wine to your liking, darling?" I asked Elena. I reached over the tablecloth and took her hand. It was cold, deathly cold, but that was to be expected in a February night. I squeezed her fingers, and for a split second I thought I felt a faint, rhythmic twitch in her palm, a muscle memory of a woman who used to pull away. As the meal progressed, I noticed the other diners began to whisper. A young couple at the next table was staring at us with expressions of growing discomfort. I ignored them. They didn't understand the depth of a commitment like ours. They didn't understand that love doesn't end just because a heart stops beating or a promise is broken. "Sir," Leonard whispered, leaning so close I could smell the peppermint on his breath. "The guests, they are complaining about a scent, and there is something leaking from your chair. Perhaps we should move you to a more private area?" I looked down. A dark, viscous fluid was indeed seeping out of the velvet box on the third chair, staining the pristine white tablecloth like a spreading ink blot. It was the color of old wine, but the consistency of motor oil. "It's just a gift, Leonard," I said, my voice rising just enough to silence the nearby tables. "A very old, very precious gift. Why is it that in a city of millions, no one can mind their own business?" I reached for the box and slowly, almost reverently, lifted the lid. Inside was a human heart. It wasn't fresh, it was covered in a fine, white mold that looked like delicate lace, and it was pulsing with a slow, agonizing rhythm that shook the box. It was the heart I had taken from the man who tried to convince Elena to leave me 3 years ago. I had kept it in a jar of brine and honey, waiting for the right anniversary to present it as a trophy of my devotion. The restaurant went deathly quiet. I heard the sound of a wine glass shattering on the floor across the room. Elena finally moved. She didn't turn her head. Her entire body creaked like the hull of a ship caught in an ice floe. She leaned over the table, her jaw dropping open with a sound like wet leather being torn apart. A swarm of black, furry moths flew out of her throat, drawn to the flickering candlelight in the center of the table. "Happy Valentine's Day, Elena," I whispered, holding the moldy, pulsing heart toward her. I don't remember the police arriving. I only remember the way the heart sounded when it finally burst under the pressure of my grip. A soft, wet pop that sounded exactly like the ghost of a kiss. They found me sitting there in the amber light, covered in that black, oily fluid, still holding Elena's cold, stiff hand. They told me she had been dead for weeks, hidden in the crawl space of our home. They told me I was a monster. But they don't know what I know. They don't know that as the moths touched the flame and burned, she leaned in and whispered, "Thank you." Love is a heavy thing, and sometimes you have to break it apart just to see what's still beating inside. I bought the house on the cliffs because I wanted a place that matched the hollowed-out landscape of my own soul. They called it the Widow's Watch, a tall, spindly structure of salt-bleached wood and gray stone that looked as though it were leaning away from the churning black Atlantic, terrified of its own reflection. The local legend was a simple, tragic thing. A sea captain's wife had waited 50 years for her husband's ship to crest the horizon, eventually dying of a broken heart on Valentine's Day. I found the story poetic in its futility. I didn't believe in ghosts. I believed in the absolute, crushing silence of the ocean. But during my first Valentine's Day in the house, I realized the silence was a lie. It was merely a shroud for something much louder. It started exactly at midnight. I was lying in the master bedroom, watching the moonlight shatter against the black waves through the window, when I heard it. Thump, 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 thump. It was faint at first, a rhythmic vibration coming from somewhere behind the heavy oak headboard. I assumed it was the house settling, or perhaps the tectonic groan of the cliffs under the battering of the winter surf. But the sound was too deliberate, too organic. It had a biological tempo that made my own heart try to sync its rhythm in a panicked, stuttering response. I stayed awake until the gray light of dawn, the sound never wavering. The next night, it was louder, echoing through the floorboards like the beat of a massive, subterranean drum. And by the third night, it was accompanied by a new sound, a dry, frantic scratching, the unmistakable noise of fingernails desperately raking against stone. I am a man of logic, of cold facts. I told myself a stray animal had crawled into the insulation and was trapped. I took a sledgehammer to the plaster. I expected to find a burst pipe or the skeletal remains of a raccoon. Instead, I found a void, a hidden, windowless chamber no larger than a coffin built into the very spine of the house, between the master bedroom and the chimney. Inside sat a man. He was dressed in a tattered naval uniform from the 19th century, the brass buttons covered in a thick, green layer of oxidation. His skin was the color of old, oil-soaked mahogany, stretched so tight over his facial bones that his teeth were permanently exposed in a jagged, skeletal grin. He wasn't a ghost. He was a mummified body, perfectly preserved by the salt air and the strange, resinous cedar used to build the room. But his chest was moving. His ribs were rising and falling in a slow, agonizing rhythm that shook the very foundation of the house. Thump, thump. He opened his eyes, milky, white orbs that looked like pearls found in the deepest, most pressurized trench of the sea. He reached out a hand, his finger joints clicking like dry twigs snapping in a frost. "Is she here?" he wheezed. The voice sounded like wind through a cracked reed, ancient and hollow. I backed away, the sledgehammer slipping from my sweat-slicked fingers and thudding onto the rug. Who? The widow? She's dead. She's been dead for 100 years. The man's head lolled to the side with a sickening crack of vertebrae. She promised every year a piece of herself to keep the fire burning, to keep the pulse going. I looked at the floor of the secret chamber and my stomach turned a violent somersault. It was littered with hundreds of small, shriveled objects, some decades old, some looking almost fresh. I realized with a jolt of pure, visceral nausea that they were human parts. Severed ears, shrunken fingers, tongues, even desiccated eyes that stared up at me from the dust. The widow hadn't died of a broken heart. She had dismantled herself year by year, offering her own flesh to some dark, forgotten alchemy to keep her husband's pulse going in the walls of the house they had shared. And now, she was truly gone. There was nothing left of her to harvest, and the captain was hungry. I felt a sharp, searing pain in the center of my chest, as if a hot needle had been driven into my sternum. I looked down and saw a red thread, a thin, pulsing line of my own blood emerging from my skin and stretching through the air toward the man in the wall. It was a physical connection, my own vein being pulled by an invisible, magnetic force that defied every law of physics I knew. I tried to run, but the house had become a living trap. The doors didn't just lock, they vanished, the wood grain sealing over the frames until the walls were seamless. The wallpaper began to pulse, turning the deep, bruised color of an internal organ. I realized then that the house wasn't just a building, it was a heart, and I was the fresh blood it needed to keep the legend alive for another century. I am standing at the window now, watching the black Atlantic. I cannot speak. My tongue was the first thing the house claimed last Valentine's Day, a silent sacrifice to the captain's appetite. But I can hear him behind me, standing in the doorway of the bedroom. He is stronger now, his skin starting to look plump and pink, like mine once did. And I am starting to look like the things on the floor of the chamber, dry, gray, and hollow. Every February I lose a little more of my weight, a little more of my soul. But the heartbeat in the walls has never been stronger. Love is a debt, and in this house, the interest is paid in flesh. I have always believed that flowers are the most honest witnesses to human suffering. We buy them to apologize for things words cannot fix, and we lay them on graves to comfort ourselves, not the dead. I am a florist by trade, but in the quiet, salt-crusted town of Oakhaven, I am known as something else, a curator of the static. My shop, the Wilted Rose, sits in the shadow of the old lighthouse, and while other florists deal in the ephemeral beauty of spring, I deal in the eternal. I developed a process years ago, a combination of vacuum sealing and a volatile, resin-based chemical bath that arrests the decay of a bloom at its absolute peak. It is a preservation of a moment, a way to freeze the heartbeat of a gift. People bring me the flowers from their weddings, their first dates, or their funerals, and I return to them a bouquet that will never wilt, never brown, and never die. But eternity, as I have learned, always carries a hidden price. On the 1st of February, the bell above my door gave a lonely, metallic chime. A woman named Clara stepped in. She didn't look like someone celebrating Valentine's Day. She looked like someone who had been hollowed out from the inside. Her skin was a translucent, sickly ivory, and her eyes were rimmed with a raw, weeping red that suggested she hadn't slept since the previous winter. In her trembling hands, she clutched a bouquet of white lilies. They were in a state of advanced rot. The stems were slimy with a gray film, and the petals were turning translucent, smelling of stagnant pond water and old copper. "He gave them to me on our last Valentine's Day," she said. Her voice was a dry, papery rasp, the sound of a dead moth's wings against a window pane. "I've tried everything to keep them alive. Sugar, aspirin, even my own, but they are slipping away. If they die, Julian, he truly dies. You have to stop the clock, please." I took the bouquet from her, and as our fingers brushed, a jolt of ice-cold static shot up my arm, settling in the base of my skull. I brought the lilies down to my basement laboratory, a sanctuary of glass jars, copper coils, and the constant, low-frequency hum of industrial refrigeration. It was a place where I felt in control, a place where I dictated the laws of biology. But as I began the treatment, the lilies didn't behave like any flora I had encountered in 20 years of business. When I injected the stabilizing resin into the primary stem, the flower didn't just stiffen, it shuddered. A faint, wet sound, like a sigh caught in a throat, echoed in the small room. I checked the vents, the pipes, the seals on the windows. Everything was tight. The sound had come from the plant. By the second week of February, the atmosphere in my shop had become suffocating. The air was no longer filled with the sharp, clinical scent of formaldehyde and resin. Instead, it was saturated with a thick, spicy cologne, a scent I recognized with a jolt of visceral fear. It was the fragrance favored by Clara's late husband, Thomas. He had been a man of immense wealth and an even larger capacity for cruelty, a man who had died in a violent car wreck just a year ago. Now, his scent was emanating from the lilies. I began to have dreams that felt more like transmissions. I dreamt I was lying in a garden where the soil was made of crushed bone and the rain was warm and metallic. The lilies weren't in jars, they were growing out of the seams of my floorboards, their roots weaving through my bedsheets and into my skin. In the dreams, the flowers had eyes, milky white orbs in the center of their blooms that watched me with a terrifying, intelligent hunger. On the morning of February 14th, the day of the delivery, the lilies were finished. They were masterpieces of my craft. The petals were a brilliant, blinding white, and they felt like soft, warm leather to the touch. But as I reached to place them in a crystal vase, a thorn, a sharp, obsidian needle that had sprouted overnight, pierced my thumb. A single drop of blood fell onto the center of the largest bloom. It didn't roll off. The petal absorbed it instantly, the white surface turning a deep, bruised purple that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic tempo. I stared at it, my heart hammering against my ribs. The flower wasn't just preserved, it was feeding. Clara arrived at noon. She looked even worse than before, gaunt, her hair thinning, her movements jerky and mechanical. When I handed her the bouquet, she didn't look at the flowers with love. She looked at them with a desperate, terrifying relief. "Do you hear it, Julian?" she whispered, leaning so close I could see the fine web of broken veins in her eyes. "The pulse. He's so much stronger now." I watched from the window as she walked away, clutching the bouquet to her chest. As she reached the corner of the street, I saw the stems move. They didn't just sway in the wind, they coiled. The green vines wrapped around Clara's neck, disappearing beneath her collar. She didn't struggle. She simply tilted her head back and laughed, a sound that was half human, half rustling leaves. That night, I couldn't leave the shop. I was drawn to the basement by a magnetic, primal force. When I opened the door to my laboratory, the scent of the cologne was so overpowering it made my eyes water. The jars on my shelves were no longer filled with the specimens I had collected over the years. The resins had changed. The chemical baths had turned into a thick, dark soup. In the center of the room stood a figure. It was made of thousands of white petals and thick, pulsing vines. It had the height and the silhouette of a man, but its face was a giant, uncurling lily. And inside that bloom, I saw Clara's emerald engagement ring, suspended in a mass of translucent nectar. "Happy Valentine's Day, Julian," the thing said. The voice didn't come from a mouth. It was a vibration that shook the jars on the shelves, a synthesis of 1,000 whispers. "Thank you for the shelf life." I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, leaving behind my shop, my life, and my craft. I live in a world of concrete now, far from the reach of the ocean and the soil. But every morning I wake up and find a single white petal on my pillow. It is warm, it smells of spicy cologne, and when I touch it, I can feel a faint, steady heartbeat beneath the surface. Love, I realized too late, isn't meant to be eternal. Some things are meant to die, and when we refuse to let them go, we only give them the chance to grow into something that can never be satisfied.